a happy Chris Battersby, getting ready to present to us. Now, the thing about Chris is we know Chris from the past because he presented to us a couple of years ago on procurement contracting, and that was a very worthwhile presentation. So he's kindly agreed to come and talk to us again, this time on portfolios. He's got a big background in consultancy, and before he moved into the National Audit Office, and I'll let Chris explain any more about himself if he feels he needs to, and ask you, Chris, now to go into your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and welcome everybody, and thank you so much for cancelling your football appointment later to listen to this. So I think, yeah, that introduction's fine. My background's in, I started actually as a COBOL programmer 35 years ago or so, and I'm now at the end of a career where I think I would probably still be being paid more as a COBOL programmer than as an auditor, which is slightly ironic. But I've been at the National Audit Office for the last 8 years, auditing a wide variety of government projects. And over the last, and also doing some secondment, so secondment to the United Nations to audit their major programs, and also to the Home Affairs Committee in the House of Parliament to help them looking at Home Office projects. So a lot of experience, but what I've actually achieved in that is really recognising that there are patterns in the way government gets projects right, and certainly patterns in the way government gets projects wrong. And I hope in this presentation I can bring some of that knowledge and even wisdom to you. So for those of you, it's quite hard when I can't actually see an audience at all. So if any of you would like to put your pictures up, then that would be useful. But normally, you know, it's quite difficult to gauge the feeling of the meeting. So I'll assume that we're starting from quite a low knowledge of the National Audit Office, which was actually established in 1921 by Act of Parliament to audit all government accounts, and also to evaluate value for money from major investments by government, which tends to be major projects. The NAO is independent, and we report actually to the Public Accounts Committee in Parliament, and we're not part of government. People sometimes get that a little bit wrong. We're what they call the fourth line of defence. So within projects in government, the first line of defence is obviously project management, and then it moves up through the internal audit within government departments, and we are the fourth line of defence, and in fact the last pretty much line of defence, holding government to account and helping them improve public services. Now, traditionally, the NAO has been accused rather of bayoneting the wounded on projects, and certainly on IT projects, by coming at the end of them and telling people that they did it wrong. And we're trying to change that that approach, or that perception, I suppose, by not moving into a consultancy area, although that was one of the reasons I came into the NAO as somebody with a lot of consulting experience in companies like Origin and Deloitte. But to try and get in early to see where projects are perhaps starting to go wrong, and to give a bit more assurance that money will be well spent in the future, as well as looking back and saying that money was not well spent in past programs. So the first thing we're trying to do at the moment is to make sure that investments in projects, etc., are being wisely invested, and we're trying to automate that a little bit using data analytics, etc., to compare costs, etc., across projects and government. The second thing we're trying to do is increase our impact. So what we say is, or our recommendations are actually taken up all our reports produce recommendations, but very often, as with I think all of you in projects, when a project finishes, you move on and you try to forget the last one and move on to the next project. So what we're trying to do is make a recommendation stick. And the other thing is we really focusing on being independent. So we're not giving consultancy advice. We don't have any axe to grind with anybody, but we want to be independent. Does anybody have any questions just about the role of the NAO before we move into the meat of the subject? Doesn't sound like it, so I can't see any big numbers appearing on the chat. So what I'll do now is move on to this presentation, which is really driven by some work I was doing at the NAO into projects and programs. And we were finding that increasingly governments are managing work as portfolios of work. And the tradition of having very standalone independent projects and programs is changing. And it has implications for several things. One thing is it has a very big implication on audit, because it's a lot more difficult to audit a portfolio than a project. An auditor needs something to audit against, and there isn't a lot to audit against in portfolios. So we were trying to put together a sort of schema that will allow us to do that audit. And start off with this sort of big questions. What do we mean by a portfolio? Because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think I went on my first project management or PRINCE course in about 1985. And everything was very clearly defined at the time. PRINCE had come, I think it was before PRINCE 2 actually. But a project was a very well-defined thing. Projects have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They have a manager. They have a huge number of tools to help them proceed and to help them be checked that they're running to schedule, etc. A lot of literature around them. And actually, at the time, I was in the private sector, but the work done by the CCTA in government was absolutely brilliant in helping people in the private sector who are new to IT and computing to actually, have a map to work to when going through projects. Then sort of moving on into probably the 1990s, programs started to appear in the work I was doing. And one quick question, just slightly to check. Oh, somebody's put something in the chat, but one quick question is, what do you think the difference between a program and a project is? So has anyone come up with a nice clear definition for me? Nothing there by the sound of it. So I think traditionally, or the words I've heard for years and years are that kind of programs are more important than projects, and program managers get paid more than project managers, and et cetera, et cetera. So that sort of developed in the 90s. But then there became a definition that, well, actually projects are all about outputs and programs are all about outcomes. And I think auditors, accountants and IT people develop a feeling that, oh good, we've got an answer to that. So projects is all about outputs, programs all about outcomes. I thought, well, that's great, but ever since then I've never found anybody capable of, oh, Barbara, welcome, it's nice to see your face. I've never really seen that much clarity between the two in the work that's carried out. So
Chris,
maybe
Chris, we've got some feedback from Robert Blakemore.
Great.
The definition of program is a collection of related or dependent projects.
Yeah, I think it's lots of projects together. And actually, you may be able to say that a portfolio is a collection of related programs and projects as well. And that is, by and large, the case, that it will be a collection and that it will be larger. But I think the definition that said it's between outcomes and outputs can be slightly misleading. So yeah, let's stick to that one of a program is a collection of projects, for now anyway. Now let's think about a portfolio. Now, portfolios mean mentioning that most of you have probably got a pension, which is actually an investment portfolio. It's a set of investments that are pulled together to give you a reasonable balance between return and risk on your money. And that's the financial view of a portfolio. Definitions do tend to vary. Going back to the definition we just had, which is it can be a collection of programs to structure and manage investments, and also to optimize strategic benefits. That is the official government view. That's from the Green Book, the government Green Book. The APM has a slightly different definition, which is up here for you to read, maybe with a slightly more commercial bent than government. And there are some pretty good tools around. The government's produced, or the Cabinet Office has produced its assurance workbooks, and I suggest anybody just gov.uk and look for portfolio and assurance workbooks, etc., and pick them up. These are really good manuals, and they take me back to the old CCTA days. And unfortunately, I don't think many people read them because they're a bit dull. Or people tend to go on courses and read them and then completely forget about them after the following weekend. But they're really good reference books. They do set government standards. It's just a shame that very often we don't see those standards followed. There are also many tools out there by most of the major consultancies defining what they mean by portfolios. Some of them tend to veer towards sales documents rather than anything particularly helpful for you. But worth trawling the web for those. And the final one is actually a framework that I put together about a year ago at the NAO to try and pull these together. And the rest of this talk will be looking through that framework and see what we have found in the NAO about portfolios. I should have really asked at that point, has anybody else got a good, clear definition of what a portfolio is? Those are my views, and this is really what I found out. But is there any feedback on what a good one looks like? Well, I'll give you my favourite definition, and that's something that comes out in quite a lot of assessments of sort of big pieces of work, which is, you know, when you are running a big program or a portfolio, then you have to think of two things, and these things are about doing the right things. So that's really about strategy, making sure that what you're investing in and what you're deciding to have as a project and what not is the right thing to do for your organization. And then on the same side of the coin, really, is then when you decided that, to make sure that you roll out those strategic initiatives in a way that actually produces the result you intended. So doing the right things and doing the things right. And within that sort of almost virtuous circle of how to run your business, how to run your organization, you need to think about quite a lot of factors. You need to think about what you're doing is about implementing the strategy. And when you're looking at your portfolios, you need to continually recheck with yourself that the strategy is actually still being focused on, and that projects aren't suddenly either becoming redundant within that strategy or veering off in perhaps the wrong directions. So to do that, you need to take a holistic view of what's going on, and that can be very difficult, and we'll go into that point later as well. In fact, all these points later. Portfolios are about making investment decisions, and that's something that I find is quite different between government and the private sector, because I sometimes get the feeling in government that government doesn't feel it's spending its own money, and that the programme and the portfolio sort of takes over. And also in government, it's quite difficult sometimes to work out whether you're actually getting a return on investment, because a lot of your returns are social returns. They are returns on implementing policy. And so actually the government has changed the Green Book recently to allow business cases, for example, to reflect not just financial benefits, but also to reflect social benefits from programmes. And I hope that takes hold in future projects. So it's investments, not just return on investment, return on money, but also return on or the exchange of money for social benefit. Another thing about portfolios is they don't stand alone. And I don't know how many of you are sort of full-time project managers, but it's really, really easy when you run your project, especially an IT project, I think, because most of the businesses you work in aren't particularly interested in the nuts and bolts of IT projects. So there's a tendency to sort of sit in a sealed room and run your project without really seeing what else is going on in the organisation. So when you're running portfolios, it really is important to make sure that the business as usual, especially in commercial organisations, the business as usual that is actually generating the cash to pay for your projects is considered when you are resourcing your projects, when you are making changes, when you are telling business as usual that they can't have any changes because you're running a big project to replace what they're doing at the moment, etc. That is all taken into account. And the next point is portfolios being about compromise, about taking those, as we've already said, with programs is a set of projects. Not all those children are equal. You may have to invest or change your investment decisions in those projects as the whole program rolls out, and therefore even more so when the portfolio runs out. You need to take decisions when you're managing portfolios to stop projects and programs. And I found, having been a project manager myself, ain't nobody going to tell me to stop my project. I'm like the guy on the bridge over the River Kwai, the colonel. I'm going to build this bridge, whatever happens. And nobody's going to stop my project. And that defensiveness is pretty pervasive in all projects. The next thing is portfolios tend to be about transformation. So they're not just about replacing like for like in an organisation. They can include elements that do that. But they're also about transforming businesses. And finally, portfolio directors and managers need to think slightly differently. Again, back to the difference between project management and program management. I think a project manager traditionally will be very much a sort of sergeant major type of get it done. Where are your deliverables? Here's the time scale, here's the timetable, here are the milestones, hit all of these. A program manager or director is more of a somebody who needs to help the program along, who needs to move obstacles out the way, who needs to communicate with stakeholders and businesses to make sure the program actually moves forward, as well as making sure that the project element gets delivered. And then when you look at portfolios, then you need to think slightly more differently and have a strategic hat on that says, is this still moving towards achieving the strategic benefits that we set out to achieve? Whilst we've been running this portfolio, which can take several years, has the external environment changed? So we need to change our tack a little bit to meet changing circumstances, to pick up new pieces of technology, new ideas, etc. So,
Chris, before you move on, can I just read out the comments we've had on the definitions of
absolutely,
portfolio? And you may want to comment on those. Right, Simon's first comment was a portfolio is the everything. Right, okay, thanks, Simon. The next one from John Baker, all projects and programs in the organisation. I'm sure that's the case for some organisations. And then Enrique says portfolio achieves strategic objectives. It's set up to achieve strategic objectives. And then Kenny says portfolio is a collection of independent or dependent programs. And Robert Blakemore, he's come back again, saying a correctly prioritized set of programs to logically build a strategic capability. And then Enrico adds, portfolios have organizational scope that changes with the strategic objectives of the organization. So most of that seems to fit in with the sort of words you're saying, Chris, I think.
Yeah, I think it picks up the holistic nature of portfolios. I think the alignment with strategy is very important, that it's really everything you need to do to implement a strategy. I don't think they necessarily have to include all the projects in the organization. For example, some projects, especially IT projects, well, no, all projects, there can be ones that are there for example, regulatory change. So they're not part of the portfolio, they're things that have to happen. Refreshes of your hardware, etc. That has to happen. And the portfolio needs to be aware of those things, but it shouldn't be there governing those things. But by and large, yeah, it's that overall strategy. I suppose you could say if it is that overall strategy, then the people in charge of it must be at a very high level in the organization, because they're the only people with the breadth of authority, responsibility, and probably knowledge of the business as well to be able to run these things. So it's, again, we find in government that sometimes you get a portfolio manager who's parachuted in because they're a good program or project manager who actually flounder quite badly. I worked on 2 of the universal credit reports in government, the early ones, and they got through, I think, 5 senior responsible owners. And some of those people were seen as being very forceful characters, people who got things done, but that wasn't the all that needed to happen to make the portfolio successful. They needed to not only get things done, but also get compromises made and agreed, and that didn't happen. But nice to know that I think we've got a common understanding at the high level of what this is. So thanks for that. And feel free, if you've got an urgent question or a clarification needed, then pop it up on the chat, and then you can stop me anytime, on the understanding that I might not exactly pick up where I left off because my mind might have wandered, but that I think it's useful to stop these things so you don't just get me talking at you during this presentation.
I've got another input for you, Chris, from Colin Godbold. I think it links in with what you were saying about other things that have to get done as well. And he says, portfolio may also include some live services with connections to the major programs.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, and that is the business as usual angle of it, in that and recognizing that you have stakeholders who are not necessarily directly incorporated in the portfolio, but are very much impacted by it. It takes me, I remember once I used to work for Philips, and we were implementing SAP in the factories, and the program director made a presentation about what a great product SAP was, and 2 years before it went live, he said, and therefore we can dispense with all our factory accountants. And of course, all the factory accountants weren't very happy, and worse, they all left. And so the factories didn't have an accountant for 2 years whilst the system went in, and they had nobody to advise on what the system was supposed to be accounting for. So it's pretty important that you manage your stakeholders and recognise there are a wider group than your project and programme teams. I hope I don't get sued by Philips for that. It was one of those magic moments of, whoops, what did he say again? So what we've done is put together a framework to help anybody, actually, and this was put together by people internally at the NAO. I pulled together all of our areas from expert areas around the NAO from the what we call the value for money audit teams. So people who go around auditing big projects. And we also consulted with heads of profession in government, which was actually a really great thing to do because A, they've got a huge amount of knowledge, and B, normally when we talk to them, it's because we're telling them off for getting something wrong, which is not very fair sometimes. And to actually do something positive with heads of profession and recognise that actually they have the knowledge and skills to get things right was very beneficial for all of us. And the other thing it pulled out was the fact, as we're just saying on the definitions of portfolio, you have to take a holistic approach. Where those boundaries are, I think we'll probably always differ on, where business as usual needs to be included and doesn't, not quite sure. Where the stakeholders are, not quite sure. But we certainly need to take a holistic approach, and we also need to make sure that we have the right mindset, and the right mindset in portfolio managers and people working on the portfolio as well, the project and program managers who are reporting up to the strategic level and getting things done and making sure they're coordinating the stuff they get done with each other. So it's as much about thinking as process, about mindset as process. And so we put together this tool that when you get these slides, you'll be able to link in or just Google NAO portfolio framework, and you'll get the stuff up. It's all in the public domain, and it contains some sort of handy tips and also references to our own reports. Sorry about that clock. There's nothing I can do to stop it. I've been trying for years. So what we did was we looked at the value that portfolios and thinking in a portfolio way can add to an organisation, and then broke it down into areas where we would be able to look and audit, because we are auditors, we're not consultants. I keep having to remind myself of that. And now if I go through these 6 areas, we'll get an idea of where I'm heading on this. And the first point is that portfolios need to have a clear purpose, and it has to be consistent, and it has to be understood, and it has to be delivered. All those smart things you learn on day 1 of running projects are all up there on day 10,000 when you are running a portfolio. But surprisingly, we find in a lot of cases that isn't actually there, that people get too, start early and get too buried in the projects and programs and lose sight of the strategic objectives of a portfolio. Increasingly, and that seems to be happening, I think I'm a great advocate of Agile, but Agile tends to give people an option to think, well, it's all going to change, so don't really need to focus on an endpoint. I can go with the flow on this one. But really, you need to think about the strategic objectives. Those objectives may change during the life of the portfolio, but the understanding of it has to be shared, and the objectives have to be aligned. So you can't have competing projects. You have to have people working in harmony and alignment. You also need people with authority to change things. And I'll probably come up onto this a little bit later, but we're finding that increasingly portfolios of work such as levelling up or net zero cross departmental boundaries, and government departments can be very effective in themselves, but when they try and start working together, things can go horribly wrong, especially when there is a small department and a big department. The big department tends to win. We've seen quite a lot of examples of poor alignment across departments in achieving the strategic objectives that are set by Parliament, that are set by ministers, set by Parliament. But mainly it's about having a clear definition of objectives. So one example, and all these examples, right, where you see the blue bit, all these examples are links to from this presentation, which you'll get later on, to NAO reports. In the our review of digital transformation in the NHS, the aim was to make a paperless NHS, which is fine at a meeting level in a ministry somewhere or other, but actually it didn't help the medical or the clinicians that much. And so it didn't achieve its objectives, and things started to go astray. As the policy got reiterated, people realized, well, actually, we can't be completely paperless because paper is needed in some NHS areas, environments, or whatever. And the strategy kept being revised because of cuts or complaints or whatever. And so the digital transformation hasn't actually happened yet in the NHS. It may do in the future, but clearer objectives and monitoring of those objectives and doing something when those objectives have to change would have made investment in digital in the NHS a lot more effective. So the next thing that needs to happen is when you're putting together a portfolio, and sometimes a portfolio will emerge in government. There'll be a number of projects. I think HMRC is probably the best example of this, where HMRC, I think 6-7 years ago, had 350 different projects that all had something to do with change. So John Thompson, who was then permanent secretary at the in HMRC, decided to pull them together into a portfolio of work because they're all about change. So why on earth have 350 competing project managers? But to do that, you need to set up your program, your portfolio well, and that can be very, very difficult. It's hard enough running lines of communication when you've got a hierarchy of maybe 3 levels or 3 people. When you're doing it across a whole or multiple government departments, it's much more difficult. So just check some rules. Is information clear and timely? Have you a way of assessing poor performance as well as good performance, so you can manage the different speeds of different project streams that you're in charge of? Can you pick up early warning indicators? So often we see the bigger the portfolio, the bigger the good news culture that comes out, and things don't get reported up till too late, or there aren't any leading indicators that say something's going wrong. It's only when you get the lagging indicators, maybe 6 months after they've gone wrong, that you can make a decision on changing. And one way around that is by checking that the portfolio carries out scenario planning, to just check what would happen if something were to happen. And I'll go and fly my little rocket around the moon a bit on this, because we're trying to get departments to do scenario planning, but they all say they're far too busy managing projects to actually take time out to manage scenarios. But I've known, when I was in consulting, customers in the private sector who say it's utterly important that your teams are going through regular, maybe 6-monthly or annual scenario planning exercises, not so that that scenario will happen, but that they will know what to do when something happens, something different from the norm. And that's something maybe we've learned from COVID in government, that parts of government were quite mobile and did react well. Others said, oh, well, we got a scenario, but the scenario's for flu, not for COVID, so it's not going to work, because they hadn't done enough, or they'd seen it as an academic exercise. So scenario planning is useful and important. And this example is from Net Zero, which, you know, was set up as a great ambition, but as the portfolio started to hit the road, then we found, and probably they found as well, that the metrics and measures weren't in place to see how well net zero or progress towards net zero was going on, because different organisations had different pieces of information and they couldn't bring them together. So the Treasury wasn't able to say what was invested, and BEIS wasn't able to say what was being done in a financial way and communicate with the Treasury. So it's really important that you set up at the beginning your model of information, your model of data, your relationships throughout the whole chain, from the operating levers at the bottom, sort of thinking a bit Kaplan and Norton here, but the operating, the things that are happening at the coalface, to the strategic decisions that are being made at the top of the organisation, and make sure that those lines of communication are short and that the data is consistent across them. Any questions so far, by the way? Is this making sense, is the first question. Please, David, if anything comes in, just interrupt me. And oh, Robert. Do you want to answer your question directly, Robert, as you put your hand up?
Robert, if you want to turn your mic on and talk to us, that would be okay.
Oh. Okay, well, it could be a technical thing there, but if the question, a chance to ask the question comes up, then please ask it and interrupt me. The next point is about when you're setting up a portfolio, is checking that you can do it, that you've got the money and that you've got the capability. And it kind of upsets me sometimes when I look at even simple projects in government, that as soon as government gets funding from Treasury, they tend to go ahead and do their project as quickly as they can, because they need to spend the money before the end of the spending review period. And the NAO office is next to Victoria Station, and I look out the window and look at the trains coming out of Victoria and thinking, would you actually let that train leave the station if it didn't have a qualified driver? Because so often you don't have a qualified professional leading these portfolios and projects. It's as if somebody, you know, a commuter said, oh, I think I can drive this. What can be difficult about driving a train? And people do that in government projects as well. Just, well, let's get going on it anyway, and then we'll get a senior responsible owner, or we'll get a decent project manager in place. And getting the resources, especially in government, getting the technical resources, which is well nigh impossible at the moment, and will be for the next couple of years if government continues to be so out of kilter with pay scales in the private sector. The next thing is to make sure that when you set up a portfolio, you realise that to achieve the strategic objective which may not be achievable until you've done 5 years of work, you need to know that the funding is in place for those 5 years of work. And so often that doesn't happen because of the way government works in its funding, with annual, for local authorities, etc., with annual budgets and with spending review periods that can vary from anything from 6 months to 5 years in departments, that people tend to get going with only half the money, and a little bit like that programme Grand Designs on the telly, get halfway through building the house and then find they haven't got any money, or they haven't got the resource and capability to finish the job. Also, with the setup, you need to make sure that you take advantage of the scale of the job you're doing, and where necessary, make sure you can move people across parts of the portfolio from project to project without anything getting in your way. So that's where the authority of the portfolio manager becomes very important, and also where you need to have that flexibility in the way people are managing their projects. and then the last thing is about just being able to control costs. So the people at the top of the portfolio really need to have their handle on the budgets, and that's a problem we found certainly with Net Zero, that people didn't have information on the costs, never mind the levers to control the costs of this portfolio work. And finally, on looking at the setup, sorry, I think I've got 2 slides in this stuff. It's useful to have a portfolio office that coordinates across the portfolio. Government does like rather a lot of paperwork to be attached to projects, and the portfolio office needs to sometimes gets completely swamped by paperwork coming off all the different projects and programs. But you need to have a good set of communicators who can collate information and send it out in a consistent way to make sure that things are going to plan, and that plans are understood, that dependencies are understood, that risks are understood, right across the organisation or the multiple organisations involved in the portfolio. And again, we found that with EU exit, certainly the Cabinet Office tended to hug its information, and it was almost a sort of security thing that they wouldn't let other departments know what was going on with Brexit negotiations. So therefore, the other departments, especially the poorer cousins like DEFRA, were deprived of information and therefore couldn't make good decisions themselves on what direction to take on the outcomes of Brexit negotiations. And so I think quite a few, ranging from customs and excise or border forces, etc., to DEFRA, when we actually went forward to leave the EU, they were pretty ill prepared for what they had to do as departments. Certainly, DEFRA is now a very different department from the one it was 3 years ago, even when it was mainly handing out EU grants. It now has to make a lot of decisions around an awful lot of portfolios it didn't have to do beforehand. So that's making sure that you set the portfolio up right. And now the last couple of bits are about when you're actually delivering the portfolio. And the first area we need to look at is making sure that interdependencies are managed, and that you know who is responsible. You have a good racer, you know who's responsible, who needs to be informed, etc., on both sides of dependencies, not just your side. And I had it's a guy from Hewlett Packard, actually. I was doing some work down there years ago, and he said what's important with big programs is the white space between the processes. And if you can manage the white space, then you got it made. And it's exactly the same with portfolios. We can all write one side of an interface, but writing the two sides and realizing that and filling that gap is really, really important. Next main area you need to think about when you're running a project is making sure that the implications of decisions are considered across the portfolio. And quite often we see a decision that, especially where there are multiple departments involved in a portfolio, a decision might be made in the big department that has very little impact on them, but might have a huge impact on a smaller department that might not have the resources to cope with that decision. So it's all about good stakeholder management, but also making sure that you understand that different people have different imperatives in different organizations. You need to take those into account when you're making decisions. And finally, yeah, the obvious synergies across the portfolio. And so I can't see my slide at the bottom there with about the digital services at the border. But that's a report I actually worked on myself, and we found that there were big white space gaps in the way that the services were being put together, because it was a couple of very complex databases that need to communicate with a large number of not very well paid customs officers or border force officers. And those connections just weren't made for several years, and the programme ran considerably later than expected. That's a lot more than expected, and still not actually finished.
Chris, can I interrupt you for a sec?
Of course, yeah.
Kareem Ali has made a couple of sort of comments here.
Yeah.
And I think it might be worth him coming online and putting it out himself. He talks about the Infrastructure and Projects Authority and how it impacts on what you do. So can we get Kareem to speak? Simon, can you set him up to speak, or if you...
Yeah, I mean, anybody should be able to talk if they unmute themselves.
Right, Kareem, can you do that then?
Hi there. I'll try momentarily. I'm in a bit of a noisy environment at the moment, so forgive the background noise.
No, we can hear you
Hi,
fine.
Kareem, I can hear you.
Hi, Chris. Hi, David. Yeah, thank you for your talks. It is very useful. So my question was, there's a couple of questions I've posted. Thank you for your time. I was trying to understand how the NAO role compares to that undertaken by the RPA. So do you see them as different parts of the process, or particularly chronologically, or is there an overlap, or perhaps even a conflict with how the two organisations are operating and feeding into major government programmes?
Yeah, I'll try and explain it. The IPA is actually part of the Cabinet Office. We do work very closely with them, and we get on well together, shall we say. So there's no conflict there, I don't think. And when I talked about the 4 lines of defence, the IPA are probably the third line of defence. So they oversee major projects in government, and I think they're currently overseeing pushing 400 on it. So the numbers have gone up quite a lot recently. Their main focus, they are not independent, they're part of government, so they're government auditors. Their main focus is around risk and the risk of successful delivery of projects. So they will review a project or a programme or a portfolio, but they're only just starting to move into portfolios. And actually at the end of this presentation, I've got some links to their literature on portfolio management. So you'll be able to look that up. But it's quite embryonic because they are pretty under-resourced actually. But they look at risk, and they only look at major projects and programs. That's ones with large investments over a particular level, can't remember what it is, or that are strategically important to government. They assess those projects every year and give them a rating as to whether they think they're going to succeed or not. So they do a sort of red, amber, green rating. And they produce an annual report, which is a rattlingly good read. It's well put together, but it tends to be based on data that could be up to a year old. So you need to be slightly careful when you look at it. And the other thing, I don't know, Kareem, if you work in government, but it must be really annoying for people in government who get the IPA coming in one week and auditing their projects, and then the next week the NAO will come and audit their projects. And the NAO, there's 2 differences. I think the NAO is independent and works for Parliament, so Parliament will ask us to go into particular things. We don't look at all projects. And also that the NAO looks for value for money rather than project delivery risk as its main focus. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's very useful. Yes, I think some of their documentation is good and getting better. I've worked on projects for government, but not from within government. So via a couple of different consultancies in my past life. And then including for the Cabinet Office, and I have come across CCTA people in the past as well. So it was an interesting nod to the past for me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, actually, I came into the NAO because I was in private sector. I did some consulting work for government digital GDS, and I thought, it might be interesting doing this a bit full time. Now all my hair's fallen out over all those projects in the private sector. I can see how I can apply my head to the public sector. But it was through reviewing GDS projects. Good. So this is yeah. So I'm pretty much at the end now. So just to say that on delivery management, risk is really, really important. And when we were talking about the big departments and the small departments, it's so important that whoever's running a portfolio recognises that the risks and the risk appetite of those departments may be very different, as well as the risk appetite within your own department needed to be known and actually sort of written down at the beginning of a portfolio. But it's really important to make sure that you recognise the risk between departments may vary, or between parts of a department may vary, and also that the portfolio in itself has an overarching risk that needs to be calculated, and that isn't always the sum of the parts. So it's pretty pointless adding up all the risk registers and painting everything red, because that's what you'll find if you do a risk assessment of a portfolio. It will always be red. You need to say, what is the risk appetite for this portfolio, and what are the particular risks that managing this as a portfolio has. So it'll be risks to your overarching strategy, it'll be risks to your resources across your whole department, and probably most importantly, we touched on it earlier, I think I had a couple of questions around it, is the risk to the business as usual of not destabilizing the organization as you proceed with the portfolio. And again, going back to 2015, Department of Work and Pensions, and when it looked at welfare reform, it did tend to manage that portfolio of work by just reacting to problems. So portfolio management was more firefighting than actually driving the portfolio forward and making sure it was cohesive and coherent. There we go.
Right, I've got a couple of questions which haven't been answered yet, Chris. I mean, Simon, do you want to comment on your red, amber, green comment, which Chris has just really alluded to everything being red? Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I don't know how universal it is in the public sector, but my understanding is that if you say something's red, then your career is going to go downhill very quickly. And if you say it's green, then, well, apart from being a hostage to fortune, it means that nobody believes you anyway. So everything has to be amber, which is why the public sector decided, well, there must be some other categories, which is where we got amber, green and red amber from. So in my opinion, everything kind of floats between the red, amber and amber green categories. And is that still current in government, Chris?
Yeah, because actually the IPA has just got rid of its amber red. And therefore you only have green, amber and red in government. I think it's a double-edged sword that nobody gets fired for having having a red project in government. Maybe they should. And also it's quite that's first point. Second point on the classification is that should a project be red at the beginning and move to green because at the beginning you haven't got a clue whether it's going to work or not? Or should it be green at the beginning because you're really enthusiastic and slowly move to red when you find you can't actually deliver it? Mm-hmm. What often happens, though, and what I find most annoying with these classifications in project risk registers is nobody seems particularly interested in the amount of time spent that items in projects are spent as red. So for me, again, that's private sector. In private sector, you're allowed to be red for a week or so, but then you need to move it out of red. In the public sector, it tends to be, well, it's red because this is really difficult. And then that leads to a behavior of people saying, yeah, I really enjoy difficult projects. And sometimes by some miracle, those projects actually deliver. And I don't know about you, but all my favorite projects in the past have been, oh, that was hairy, but great fun. We really enjoyed it. Despite the fact that it went horribly wrong, we got it right in the end. That's not really how to run a project. The good projects are the ones that I've probably completely forgotten about because they all went smoothly. And probably didn't even need risk registers. But I think, yeah, between private and public, yeah, I actually see an awful lot more red ink used in public sector projects than private sector projects. And I still haven't seen anyone getting fired for having a red rating. So,
Chris, I've got another comment from Colin Godbold. Colin, to do with IPA versus NAO. Do you want to come in, Colin, with your experience? Just click on the unmute. Just click unmute.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep.
My observation,
you're there.
My observation was simply that I'm a consultant, but I lead reviews for the IPA. And I think Chris has covered it. We focus more on risk reduction going forwards. And I always position it with the SROs when we plan the reviews that what we're trying to do with the IPA review is add some value in terms of reducing the risk of the future delivery of the project or program, which means we're very much forward looking. We only look into the history to the extent that we need to understand it in order to understand the current situation. We're not really going back and worrying about why things have got to the stage they've got to. Whereas other than the fact that that may influence the recommendations we want to make, obviously, going forward. So it's a rather different approach and probably a bit more tactical than the NAO. And I think that's in line with what Chris has said. I don't know if Chris would have any comments on that. Somebody also raised something in the chat about why, given that the IPA has stage gates, which supposedly are there to stop projects moving forward when they're not in a fit state to move forward, why do we still get so many problems? And I think the answer is it's very, very hard to get traction in the early stages, whether you're the IPA or the NAO or whatever, because politicians drive things and the departments move things through the early conceptual stages quite quickly, and it can be quite difficult to get in there on the ground and actually do the shaping that's needed to try and get things off on a good footing, would be my personal observation. I emphasize I don't work for the IPA, I'm just a contractor there doing reviews from time to time. Chris, any thoughts on those observations?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the first thing is the IPA has got quite a difficult job. I see Nick Smallwood won the award for Programme Manager of the Year or something the other day at the APM annual meeting, so he's doing a good job. But a couple of years ago, the IPA started doing what they call critical friend reviews. And they've now stopped that. And that's an area where I think the NAO and IPA has a problem in that, to what degree are we auditors who audit and come out with an audit assessment, and how much are we veering towards consulting? And the problem with making recommendations in a detailed way or as a critical friend is that if those aren't very good recommendations, or if they apply them when the project still doesn't work, whose fault is that? So there've been some difficulties around that over the last few years. You're absolutely right. The IPA, it does its reviews and is purely looking for, will this succeed in achieving its objectives? Is the big question that the IPA asks. So that's what their annual report does. It gives that big RAG rating for all the major projects in government. Yeah, I was going to say something else. I can't remember what it was now. So we'll move on to another question if there is one, I think.
So there's a good question there from Malcolm, I think, David.
Yeah. I was just about to read it out. does the National Audit Office require the department in question to actually show exec ownership and corrective action timeframes of the issues noted in the reports?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, because we write our reports for Parliament, and our reports are all laid before Parliament, and they contain recommendations. And also our reports need to be cleared by departments as being factually correct. So we make recommendations. Quite often they are maybe changed a little bit because the department said they're not factually correct because they're talking about the future. So they've got a bit of a cop out there. However, what then happens with our reports is they are presented to the Public Accounts Committee. The Public Accounts Committee will hold a hearing in Parliament, and they're well worth zooming in on. If you go into Parliament TV, you can see it. As I say, I spent a year working on the Home Affairs Committee, preparing questions for MPs to ask the Home Office, which is great fun. But this is where the committee, members of Parliament, give the Permanent Secretary usually and the SRO a good grilling on the report. And then the Public Accounts Committee makes recommendations, and they tend to be more forceful than the ones we make because they're making them as independent parliamentarians. And those recommendations have to have a timescale put around them, and what's called a Treasury note is produced, and Her Majesty's Treasury will set the time frame for a response from the department, and then those responses are then reassessed by the Public Accounts Committee. So that's the way that control works. So yes, there are timescales. Yes, there are feet held to the fire, but it can be quite a long process. So yeah, some sort of early warnings might not get through for a long time.
But isn't this true, Chris, of a lot of reports that are produced after many years following disasters like Grenfell? The departments themselves, you know, seem to have free rein as to how much of it they actually deal with, you know? Yeah,
and those responsible. I mean, I'm currently working on the Emergency Services Network report, which I did in 2019 and did in 2016. Since when we've had a completely different permanent secretary and ministers. Oh, God knows how many ministers have gone through. I think it was Theresa May. So
it's the effect you have on them,
people,
Chris,
who then pick up the mess that their predecessors have left. Yeah. And there is that time. It's a shame, but that's how the process works. Which is why, as I said right at the beginning, we're trying to get in there early. Yeah.
Before it becomes a political time bomb.
Yeah. So earlier this year, I did a report on the Holocaust Memorial Project, where the diggers haven't hit the ground yet, but we're still reporting on the business case for it, on matters like, as you said before, you know, that Treasury approval tends to come quite easily. If you've got a business case that where the numbers add up, even if they don't make any sense, then they are likely to get approval from HM Treasury. I think and also that whole structure is a difficult structure, because with portfolios, you shouldn't just have one point in time where you agree to spend your £1 billion. You need to make that incremental as the strategy evolves.
The thing about that example, though, it's an example where the politics and the public reaction probably overpower the, shall we say, the mathematics of the business case.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say about the IPA, about the NAO, is the NAO cannot comment on policy because we work for Parliament and they set the policy. You know, that's the democratic process. Is if Parliament decides to spend £1 billion on a spaceship, then we just have to comment on the value for money that that spaceship gives, not the fact that it's a barking mad idea, for example. So yeah, the politics can get in the way, and sometimes the reports can become political without intending to. So say I worked on universal credit, the report we did in 2016, was it? Actually did lead to a resignation of a minister. But that's very, very unusual. Normally it's, there's the politics on one side and there's our dull, boring report on the other that's full of facts and numbers. And the twain don't always meet.
Chris, I've got another question for you.
Malcolm.
Sorry?
A question from Malcolm.
Yeah, hang on a sec, because I was going to ask you a more general question, Chris, to do with problems deciding priorities in a portfolio. I mean, do you feel that perhaps more work needs to be done in guiding people on that side of things as well?
I think certainly. I mean, I think I alluded to it. There's probably more detail in the framework we put together. What's really important in deciding priorities, in probably everything you do, is to have clear and comparable information on the priorities you're assessing, and take the human part out of it. You know, that's NAO stuff, is auditor stuff. But it's to be able to assess them dispassionately that's important. And so often you will get the forceful person in the meeting winning over that compromise by being forceful, not by being rational. And that's why when you're managing portfolios, it's your people management skills that really have to come to the fore. It's not about knowing about the technology anymore. It's about knowing about how people interact and how you can get them to face in the same direction. And giving them good information helps them face in the same direction because they're talking about the same numbers, it's talking about the same facts. But that's not all there is to it. There's just
when you're trying to deliver a dream, Chris, which doesn't have realistic numbers associated with it, then the person with the forceful personality is the one who's going to win the day. We've seen it with politicians, haven't we?
Absolutely, yeah. And I cannot comment on politics, but something like net zero or levelling up, I suspect will depend on the politicians involved rather than what the hell levelling up means or what the hell net zero means.
On the other hand, everybody else here is allowed to comment on politics in its relationship to project management.
Absolutely. Yes, as am I, I'm sure.
So does anybody else want to ask a question? Please unmute yourself and ask away while Chris is here.
Malcolm?
No,
I think we've done that question.
Hello, Chris. I just wondered if you could say something about financial aspects of the audit that you do. You've spoken mostly about the sort of project management and risk. I just wondered if you could say something about the finances. I know, Treasury Green Book used to give a discount rate, for example, so that you could consider your portfolio of projects, as sort of financial investments. I just wondered, if you could say something about that.
I can make a comment. It might not actually answer your question, but it's something it's been exercising me recently, because we're now living in a phase where inflation is actually important. And I'm old enough to remember inflation when it was important, maybe 25, 30 years ago, and it's now come back. And we've got a whole government that's got no experience of inflation, and they do put in inflationary coefficients into projects, but they're based on lagging indicators, not leading indicators. So I think the current inflation rate is 3% when you're looking at assessing projects. And what, on the numbers side, what exercises me at the moment is the fact that when putting together business cases, a lot of departments are not using optimism bias anymore. They are just putting a bit of contingency in, which tends to be plucked out of the air, or they're using, even worse, reference case data. recently looking at the programme, and they had used reference case data for what was it, for digital transformation projects, which actually could be anything to me. You know, probably loads of SAP projects got added up, and somebody worked out that they overrun by about 20% because it's a pretty mature thing. But this was used to reference a very, very complex project, a change project in government. Yeah, it was digital, yeah, it was transformation because it was change, but that was a reference point that was used. And they didn't use their own data to say, well, the previous projects we've done like this have overrun by 3 times or so. And my example on the difference between contingency and optimism bias is that most Fridays I go to the pub to have a drink with a friend of mine. And if I were to go to the pub and build in contingency, I would say, right, I always have 2 pints of beer. I might have to wait a little bit at the bar, so add in 5 minutes for that. And I might bump into somebody and have a chat, so add 10 minutes to that. So I'll add 15 minutes contingency. Meanwhile, my wife has seen me leaving at 7 o'clock on a Friday and coming back at 11 o'clock for the last 30 years. And she builds in optimism bias based on her previous experience of my trips to the pub. And that produces a very different number from my contingency. And government doesn't seem to be learning the lessons that I've learned domestically by collecting data for its previous projects and saying, well, these are the types of projects that we do that are very unique in government, but we do them quite regularly, and we know that they run by this much. But they don't build them into those business cases because they always have that early optimism of saying, yeah, well, we're going to get it right this time. And we come and say, well, you haven't got it right last 10 times, so maybe just build in something. Don't, you know, you can always say, well, we built this in, but we'll hope to get it in earlier, but they don't build it in the first place.
Can't there be, Chris, an element of they don't want to put too much pessimism in because it might get ditched?
Yeah, you can't be a project manager and be a pessimist.
Mm.
It doesn't work. You know, you're always optimistic. You always want to get the thing done. And also, I think in government and probably in the private sector as well, if you ask for too much and are realistic about it, you probably won't get the money. So, but you know that if you ask for just enough, you'll get to a stage in the project where it's too late to go back. And so they'll give you more money. So there's that human behavior to watch out for, which is what optimism bias is for.
Yeah, I think there's even more optimism bias amongst the policymakers than the program managers. But that's really interesting, a challenging question from Robert Blakemore, who unfortunately can't unmute. But he wants to know, what difference do NA reports make? What actually changes? And in the case of something like ESMCP, everybody knows the suppliers are incompetent. I'm not sure I want to be quoted or re-quoted on a comment like that. So the contracts were not fit for purpose. Rather challenging question there, I'm afraid, Chris.
It is, yeah, and I have to be quite careful because I've actually done the last 2 ESMCP reports. And it's common knowledge that Motorola have now decided not to proceed as the contractor, and that the previous contractor also decided not to proceed as the contractor. And there are many other examples where we've had, so in areas like nuclear decommissioning, it's a minefield of optimism turning to pessimism on these things. What difference do we make? Well, we have to justify ourselves. So there is actually a parliamentary committee that oversees us that sees what benefits we deliver, and we have to justify our wages. It is very, very frustrating that there are common themes in, you know, I think the question was around contracts and contractors and suppliers. Something needs to be done, and I need to be careful what I say, but something needs to be done in government to move away from their current way of contracting, which is, to me, a very wrong mix of very often going to market with little knowledge of what you actually want but lots of detail about it, which is always dangerous. There's a still, I think, which I saw in the private sector 30 years ago, and it's moved away a bit since, but this sort of confrontational relationship between the supplier and government. And my personal view is that if you are an £80,000 a year senior contract manager in government, you're not going to be able to compete with somebody who's going to get £1 million commission for selling that contract. So don't try and compete. They do it for a living, as Michael Caine said in the film, can't remember which one, Long Good Friday. No, not Long Good Friday. Get Carter, that's right. You know, they do this for a living. They negotiate contracts and they're bloody good at them. Government contract people also do it for a living, but it's a very different game, and they have to play to a much, let's say, more on a set of rules as well. So that confrontational side needs to be avoided. And yeah, these things keep repeating themselves, which is why right at the beginning I said we need to get in there earlier to say, for God's sake, don't go any further with this project, rather than at the end of it say, well, that was a disaster. Because that doesn't add value to anybody. It builds up a little bit of knowledge saying, well, these projects are disastrous, but it doesn't help anybody. Oh yeah, Carrie, I've just seen your comment coming up. Yeah. Yeah, nobody, if you look at that was a big thing I found in the private sector, never put contingency in, because first thing that the FD will do is take it out. And so you have to make it up with other things.
Yes, sorry, I accidentally hit enter a bit too prematurely on my second part of that sentence. But yes, I agreed. It was in line with something you said earlier as well, that I've had to say to many a project manager or program manager, when have you ever managed to deliver that in that amount of time before?
Yeah,
and then highlighted how often something similar or can be used as a parallel has been late. And that should be the benchmark for what you're using, not the minimum you think you can get away with in terms of your customer, whoever your internal or external customer may be.
So it just reminds me of, I did a bit of work years ago at Oxford University Press, where my client was very good at defining things. And he turned to me once and said, Chris, just I've seen the project plan. Can you tell me what the opposite of slippage is? And I said, I don't know, it's never happened. And that's how projects are. So I hope that's answered the previous question. That was Robert's question about what value do you add because these things keep happening. And you're absolutely right. We'll do second, third, fourth reports and report exactly the same things every time. It's not as if anything's changed. You know, it tends to be down to government over-programming, government not having the resources, government doing things that you would never do in the private sector. You know, when you get a new minister, when you get a new chief exec, the chief exec will come in and say, okay, I'm going to scrap these projects because they don't make sense to me. I'm going to pick this one that's going to make me look good, and I'm going to save money for the company. When you get a new minister, they say, right, I've got this idea that's been burning in my head for the last 30 years, which is why I went into politics. I'm now going to implement it as quickly as possible. And won't even think about the other projects going on. And when you get the churn of ministers we've been getting at the moment, that's going to continue. But that's a political statement, which I'd like you all to ignore, please.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Chris,
I mean, that's the problem, isn't it?
I'd love to carry on from a point that you pulled up earlier. Would you mind if I dropped you an email or found you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, sure. Or it's chris.battersby@nao.org.uk, which again, if you get the slides, I think my name's on the end of it. But
Fantastic.
You'll find me. Like Liam Neeson, you will find me.
Host.
As long as he doesn't do what Liam Neeson does to you.
Well, that did cross my mind.
I was going to comment on where you're going with the political input side of things, because quite often ministers come in and make decisions on contracts without, due rigor going into the procurement process. I mean, PPE is a brilliant example of a catastrophe because due process wasn't properly followed. Has NAO had any involvement with the follow-up of that?
Oh, huge amount. Yeah, there are several reports already produced and presented to Parliament on PPE procurement saying you didn't follow due process, which you could have done in an emergency. I mean, as it was an emergency, you were still able to follow due process, so you didn't. It wouldn't have held up the procurements. It would have stopped maybe possible criminality, etc. So yes, only about 3 reports on PPE and more in the pipeline as well.
Yes, if they'd taken that on board, Chris, then the current round of possible prosecutions would have been avoided. Yeah. So ministers beware. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that was extreme circumstances, but yeah, there was nobody there to say to them, "Whoa, stop! You have to do this." It was, "Get out of my way. People are dying here."
I suggest they were there in the way, but they just got pushed aside. Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't possibly comment, but I suspect they did. But maybe I haven't actually read our reports on PPE. I've been a bit busy recently. But there are several that were quite hard hitting.
That'll be your next
it's more things like,
presentation to us, Chris.
I remember with Universal Credit, Ian Duncan Smith came in and said, "I'm going to do this. This is going to take 3 years." Well,
on the flip,
13 years later.
On the flip side of that, though, I think there's equally a problem of how long due process can take in procurement. There could easily be a 6-month procurement program by the time you've been through all the stages of procurement. So somewhere between those 2 extremes, I think, is probably a sweet spot.
There is, yeah, and there's also that point I made earlier on portfolios about scenario planning. So if people were to do a little bit more scenario planning, they could have that scenario, and then they would say, "Well, what are the risks of this happening, and how can we overcome those risks in the present framework, and what can we recommend if this scenario does occur?" And they have done the scenario planning for flu, and maybe that included the need for special equipment for hospitals and procuring of that. So yeah, the frameworks are there, the approaches are there, but it didn't seem to happen.
Right, I think are there any final comments people want to make? Because I want to end on a positive comment from Lynn, if I can read it out. Thank you, Chris, and for being honest about the challenges which impact us all in PM land. Good luck and keep fighting the good fight for the public purse. And I completely endorse that, Chris.
Thank you. That's very, very kind. Just don't tell the press.
Right. Okay, well, look, shall we draw it to a close then, folks? I think it's probably an appropriate thing to do now. So once again, Chris, thanks again for doing a superb presentation to us. And yes, we will invite you along another time, I'm sure, to open up some more interesting cases for us. But thanks very much for tonight, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everybody.
Thank you very much. And yeah, if you circulate the slides, I'll have all those links into to all the materials and case studies, although nothing on PPE in there. It's
thanks. And to everybody else, please sign up for our future events. They're all going to be as good as this one. Okay, thanks very much then.